Salvate Omnis, welcome to this week's video tutorial. Next week will be a review week, and your second test, which will be announced, will be the week after. Let's take a look at chapter 25. We have infinitives and indirect statement as the grammar in this chapter. Infinitives can be a little bit tricky. The basic idea is clear, but as you'll see, the big challenge is translating it with the correct verb tenses, because as your book points out, in Latin, the infinitives are relative in terms of their meaning and do not have an absolute temporal dimension. But just like most things in life, with practice, it will become more intuitive and easier to do. And you also see that the examples are actually very, very short, perhaps because the authors of the textbook recognize that this grammar concept, indirect statement, and infinitives can take some time getting accustomed to for English speakers. So I recommend reading the chapter, if you haven't already done so, a couple of times, in particular, studying the examples. I think I mentioned before, the best way to approach it is to read it a couple of times, but then go back and study and take a look at the examples. And in particular, I want to take a look at, because we could spend a lot of time just going over this, so this is something you'll have to do on your own, and then of course ask questions via Blackboard discussion. But you'll see here, let me see, what am I looking for? I need to go back here, sorry. That, let's see here. One second, it's been a while since I've looked at this chapter. Trying to find where it indicates that they are relative. I know it's in here somewhere. Oh, here we go. Again, read this. You can see that it's pretty easy to recognize, but the challenge is being able to recognize and understand that you must then transform the infinitive into a regular finite verb in the correct tense, noting that the tenses of the infinitive, like those of the participle, are relative, not absolute. So as you'll see here, that these are generally verbs of senses. So they say this is present tense. So if you look at the examples here, we have to recognize that this infinitive construction is relative to the main verb. And then you can see how that would be translated. I say that because if here, dicunt they say, dix erunt they said, notice that we have the same language. But here, that he is helping her, because it's relative to the main verb, whereas here we have the same Latin language, that he was helping her, and because the main verb is dix erunt. So again, this is explained more fully when you read, but this is going to be perhaps the biggest challenge in this chapter. Also, as you'll note before we go into the examples, that probably the best way to translate it is use a that, and that indicates that we are introducing an indirect statement. Let's take a look at the examples for this week. There's our vocabulary, and here we go. So this first one here, id factum esse tum non negavit. Terence often writes in a comedic vein. So this is a good one, I think, because we need to be able to recognize, as we do no doubt, that negavit is past tense. So as we just saw a moment ago, that because the main verb is in past tense, we need to translate the infinitive relative to that. So we look at this here. he did not deny, or he didn't deny, then that was, or excuse me, that had been done. So he didn't deny then that had been done. So if we take a look at that, because this is the perfect stem, which we should be able to recognize by isti, imos istis erunt. If we go back to the example here, just to show us, we're going to have to basically follow this pattern. This is the same kind of example that we had here, but it's just in the third person. And so here's our infinitive. Actually, this one isn't as quite clear, but here's our similar kind of infinitive, and so that's where we're getting the had, because our verb negavit is in the perfect or the past tense. And so you can see here, we don't want to use present tense or even was or helped, but had helped. I'll be honest with you, when I grade your tests, I'm not going to be too dogmatic. The main thing is to get it in the past tense with the correct vocabulary and the general sense of the sentence. It is true that Latin grammar tends to be a little bit more precise than English in this regard, but this is going to take perhaps a little bit of getting used to. This is the first chapter where our online format is probably not ideal, because this would be a good example where we would practice these on the board in the classroom so that we can help you make corrections when necessary. So this chapter is really going to require a lot of independent study on your own part, much more so than the other chapters, I believe. Let's see, let's take a look at the next one here. His rebus pronunciatis igitur eam esse hostum scivisti. Now here we have an ablative absolute, so we have a review of earlier grammatical concept. Again, you will become, if not already, very comfortable in recognizing an ablative absolute. Almost always it's in the beginning of a sentence. We said before, almost always it's 2, 3, sometimes 4 words. And you can see that the endings are in the ablative. So here we have his and pronunciatis both in second declension, ablative plural, and rebus is a fifth declension, ablative plural. So we need to come up with some translation. Literally, and we said before, if we have first or second declension endings, we need to use the past tense. So perhaps something like this: after these things had been announced, or after he had pronounced these things. As we said before, that you can experiment with your different translation, but we're definitely going to need announced past tense, so ed ending, because we have the second declension ablative ending. Remember, there's only 2 ways to translate in terms of tenses, actually 3 ways, but either past, present, or future. Present always is going to be third declension endings. We don't have third declension endings here. We have second declension. So after these things had been pronounced, therefore, you knew that he was an enemy. So this one is a little bit easier, I think, than the first one in terms of how to translate it. This seems more intuitive. So isti, imos istis erunt, that is our perfect ending. Sciere is the root of the word science, of course. So you knew that. So as your book points out, let's use that for translating. And here's our infinitive esse. So literally, you knew him to be an enemy. Even that doesn't sound like the best English, but that would actually work with the literal translation. So Notice this one could also be just given the sense of the sentence, because these things had been announced. In other words, because you had known these things, therefore you knew him to be an enemy. For Cicero, of course, it's pretty obvious who was and wasn't, or rather, who was for and who was for against, rather, who was for and who was against the Republic. And so you had to choose sides during that civil war. Either you were defending and fighting for the Republic in Cicero's views, or you weren't. So it was pretty obvious if these things were announced. So there is, this one's, I think, a little bit easier. So just with these things having been announced, notice I keep, one of the things that I've had experience with students is every time you translate it, it could be something a little different. It's called creativity. If you look at different translations of different Latin texts, they're going to be very different. It's called style. No two people write alike, even though they're using the same grammatical concepts. So the important thing is, once again, is to put this in the past tense. So because these things had been announced, therefore you knew that he was an enemy. Tres eum ab hostibus expectare nunc sentis. So nunc sentis literally means now you know, or now you understand. And then here is our infinitive expression. So now you know that that he, notice as your book points out that Latin puts it in the accusative, but in English we put it back in the subject because we have a clause beginning with that. Now you know that he literally is being expected by the enemy. So now you know, in other words, in everyday English, now you know that the enemy is waiting for him. So, in fact, notice how spontaneous it was for me to say that, but notice how that grammar in English doesn't quite fit the grammar in Latin. So now you know that the enemy is waiting for him, because for him, first of all, we don't have a preposition in the original Latin. Now you know that the enemy, notice Latin puts it from the enemy or by the enemy. And of course, this is the whole virtue of learning a foreign language, like your education more broadly, is there's different methods, different techniques in all disciplines. Foreign language study is no different. Germans think differently than Americans. The Romans clearly thought differently than modern human beings. And so I assume God thinks very differently than human beings, and animals think differently or feel differently than human beings. And so we just have to get comfortable with this pluralism and be creative and sensible with our use of grammar in this case. So this one is fairly straightforward, I think. Number 4, vedi eos in urbe remanisse et nobiscum esse. So isti eat emos istis erunt. Julius Caesar, veni vidi vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. So we need to recognize this as the perfect form of I saw. So I saw, and then even this one, if you did it literally, I saw them having been remaining in the city to be with us. So that would be, you can see how the sense of it is clear, but the grammar is a little bit off. But in my experience, in fact, I still do that a lot of times. You're probably going to get a literal translation first, just to have some sense of what's going on. But again, with this somewhat tricky grammar topic, we're going to have to go back and massage out our translations. So I saw that. So just get comfortable using a that in this case. I saw that they, because we put it back per the grammar as the subject pronoun, even though the indirect statement in Latin requires the accusative. I saw that they. Now, because we're using I saw, we need that they had remained, because this is basic English grammar too. If we have the past tense, we need to use the past perfect, because that is one temporality earlier than that. For example, before I moved to North Carolina, I had lived in Chicago. That actually is the better grammar, but of course in everyday speech we might say before I moved to North Carolina, I lived in Chicago. Notice how that sounds more natural, but more accurately, more precisely, I can't live in two places at the same time, so we need to indicate our sequence of tenses by using the past perfect in this case. Before I moved to North Carolina, I had lived. So Latin really requires, especially for this topic, that we be more precise, as we keep saying, in our relative verb tenses. So I saw that they had remained in the city and had been, or were in this case, with us. All right, let's move on to quinque and number 5. Itaque aeternum bellum cum malis civibus a me susceptum esse cerno. So cerno is where we get the word to discern something, which is a kind of apperception or perception. And this is in the present tense. So itaque means and therefore, or and thus. So and therefore, I perceive, could also be translated as I know, in the sense of an inner insight, but maybe I discern or I perceive. And therefore, I perceive that, so we got to get our that in there. This is an eternal war. And therefore, I perceive that an eternal war with literally bad citizens or with evil citizens. And then this one is actually the future form of the participle. So we need to say will be not suspected, but will be, undertaken by me. Again, these passive constructions are always a little bit awkward and tricky to translate in Latin. So let's go back to just kind of tidy this one up again here. And so, and therefore, I perceive that an eternal war with bad citizens will be undertaken by me. So again, the tricky part, and you're going to have to go back and study these examples by looking at the models or paradigms, which there are a lot in this chapter. And as I said before, this is certainly the first chapter, I believe, this semester where meeting in class probably would make it a little bit easier. But if we go back and try to look at all these models now without really knowing what you do and don't perceive, we might just be talking to ourselves. So certainly on Wednesday during discussion, let's make sure we are able to match these patterns with these models. So if we look at, let's see, just let me see if I can find this one readily here. So we have susceptum esse cerno. So let's look for the participle in esse. Go back here. And so here's esse right here. And you can see, because we have the present tense, so in this case, cerno, you can see when you have esse, that we have to translate it as the future. This is what I mean by these are relative, not absolute. So the key thing, once again, is to recognize what tense the main verb is. In this case, cerno's present tense. So since we have this esse plus the participle, our translation in bold here is future tense. Future tense. Going back to our examples here, Sex idem credo tibi faciendum esse. So credo, of course, means I believe. So as we just suggested, it's important to recognize this in the present tense because this is going to be relative. So I believe. Now here where it gets interesting, we also have the gerendive, which we had in a previous chapter. Notice the nd here. So remember, this is something that ought to be done. And idem just means the same thing or the same thing. So literally, I believe that the same thing is to be done by you. So even that literal translation does work. So if you give a literal translation on the test, I would give you credit for it. So I believe that the same thing is to be done or ought to be done by you. So, or maybe a little bit better translation, I believe that you must do the same thing. In fact, that might even be the best translation. Or I believe that you should do the same thing. And you can see here's a great example where I think I believe that you should do the same things. Probably the best English translation in 2022. But notice how to get to that really requires understanding that the Latin is very different because it uses gerendives. And here, instead of saying you, this is actually in the dative, by you. And of course, we have the tricky infinitive here at the end. Number 7, but I'll stress again, these sentences are fairly short, but the concept is, as we keep saying, a little bit tricky to identify. Ultimately, you're going to have to go back and match and learn the patterns. Number 7, te enim esse fidelem mihi sceibam. Now here's our main verb. Notice it's in the imperfect, bam, base, bot, vamos, bate, spot. So I was knowing, or I used to know. And then I used to know that, because here's our infinitive again. So anytime you see esse in this particular context, you need to recognize it as the infinitive. So I was knowing, or I used to know, that you were loyal to me. So I used to know, right? Notice how even that sound. Maybe I used to think that you were loyal to me. So that one sounds, but then we're changing the meaning of the verb a little bit depending on how you translate it. So, I mean, literally. So as we keep saying, when we use the indirect statement, this is in the accusative. We need to put it back into the subject in English. So I used to think, or I used to know that you were loyal to me. Now, one thing where the Latin might help a little bit in this case is notice that te is the accusative, and so is faithful or loyal. So notice that who's the one who used to be loyal is the you in this case because the grammar matches. Octo hostibus se in civitatem vertentibus senatus quinquinato nuntiavit eum factum esse dictatorum. All right, so we got a longer sentence here. Of course, this is where we get the name Cincinnati, Ohio. And let's see here. Hostibus se in civitatem ventibus. This actually is an ablative absolute. This one actually has 5 words in it just because it has the reflexive. So we keep saying that most ablative absolutes will have 2 or 3 or 4 words. This one is the exception just because Latin requires the reflexive here. So vertentibus means like to turn. So literally now notice that we have hostibus, which is third declension. So third declension, ablative plural, is ibus, is ibus. So we're going to translate this in the present tense. So with the enemy, literally with the enemy turning itself into the city. So with the enemy turning itself into the city. Notice how that sounds a little bit weird, but I would keep it literal. I mean, as you can see, we might be able to change the preposition from with to something else a little bit later, but this one actually works fairly straightforward, at least with the grammar. So let's just stick with it for now. With the enemy turning itself into the city, Senatus, the Senate, announced to Cincinnatus that he so here's where we have to be careful, because this is past tense. If this is the Senate announced that he, as we talked about earlier, since this is simple past in English, we have to use the past perfect for the translation of the infinitive. So the Senate announced to Cincinnatus that he had been made a dictator. So that one, if we keep in mind that earlier point, notice how it seems a little bit easier to translate because we've been practicing it. So the Senate announced to Cincinnatus. Notice that Cincinnatus is the dative. The dative is to or for whom something is done. Second declension, dative singular, us eo. So the Senate announced to Cincinnatus that, we got to get our that in there, that he had been made dictator. So this one's fairly straightforward based on what we said. And then we just have to go back and look at the paradigms. And when we see that esse dictatorem, or in this case, esse dictatorem factum, that infinitive construction is relative to the verb nuntiavit. Number 9, dicote. Now here we just got done talking about the importance of the relativity of the verb tenses for this grammar concept. So we should be able to recognize this quite readily as simple present. So I say to you, Pyrrhus, that the Romans, or I guess I say to you that Pyrrhus is able to conquer the Romans. So Aeneas Pyrrhus, the Greek general Pyrrhus, defeated the Romans twice, but the victories cost him so many men that he lost the war, hence the term Pyrrhic victory. This is a little bit different, but might be a good footnote. I once read by a major Roman historian that it would have been interesting if Alexander the Great had turned west instead of east in the 4th century, in terms of how that would have panned out, because it was around that time that Rome was starting to become a major power in the Mediterranean. And of course, the fact that Alexander the Great went east, the rest is history, so to speak, because this is mere speculation, but it is possible that Rome would have been defeated and hence set back quite a bit in its military and social and political developments, and would have changed the course of human history. But of course, he did not go east, and so the Greeks and the Romans, when the Greeks were a major military power, did not come to pass, so to speak. Anyway, let's go back to this example and the grammar. I say to you that Pyrrhus is able to conquer the Romans, or you can say I say, right? I say to you that Pyrrhus can conquer the Romans. All relative. Go back and look at the paradigms, and you'll see we're going to keep it in the present tense here. Number 10. Hospice. Do they give us any vocabulary? Yeah. So hospice, stranger. and of course Sparta. So we're going to translate that as stranger. So stranger, right? So literally tell stranger to the Spartans. So stranger, tell to the Spartans, or tell the Spartans that, so we got to get the that in there again, that you saw us lying here, loyal to the fatherland. So this is in the vocative, or the imperative rather, excuse me. So stranger, tell the Spartans, you tell something to someone. So this is going to be I, which is going to be first declension dative singular. So stranger, tell the Spartans that you saw us, nos, lying, yakentes, here, loyal to the fatherland. So fatherland also is first declension dative singular. I. So we have Spartai and Patriae, both in the first declension dative singular AE endings. As we keep saying, go back and look at the paradigms, because the main verb is present tense. Here is vidice as our verb here. And so based on the fact that these verbs are relative, we're going to pretty much, although even in English it'd probably be fairly intuitive, just put it in the past tense. The stranger, tell the Spartans that you saw us lying here, loyal to the fatherland. Number 11, Socrates patabitse esse kivum totios mundi. Literally Socrates, and again, I would encourage you to do it literally to see what happens. So here, Socrates was thinking himself to be a citizen of the entire world. Notice that one actually works. Socrates thought himself to be, even that works as well, to be a citizen of the entire world. So that one actually works, I think, even in the English, if you just know the vocabulary and the grammar. You could also, since this is past tense or imperfect, you could follow the rules and saying that Socrates thought that he was a citizen of the entire world. So this one you have a couple of options following, which I think, again, is the tricky part, the relativity of the verbs. And let's see here. Yeah, maybe we'll stop there with Socrates. Generally, we do 1 through 10 in these Sententia Antiquae. Those are the ones you're going to be responsible for in the test. But anytime we have Socrates, I think we should talk about him. So take a look at 1 through 11 in this chapter before we turn now to the larger passage. So again, as I'll indicate, and as you know from the first test, for the next test focused on 1 through 10 for the Sententia Antiquae. So it looks like we have another reading from Virgil's The Aeneid. And as your book points out, this actually is a very famous work of art in the history of literature and art and intellectual history. We could talk many, many hours, in fact, about this. For example, the great German writer Lessing wrote a seminal essay in the 1760s on this, which obviously we're not going to talk about now, but needless to say, very, very famous. So let's take a look at this story. So hic alius magnus timor affabile misere animos caecos nostros terret, laecoon secudos Neptuni fortuna factis acrem tarum ad arum in latore mactabat. Tum gemeni serpentis potentis mare prementis ab insula in latura currunt, jamque agros tenebant et oculis ignea dentibus orre linguis sibilis lamebant. Nos omnes fugimus ille via certe laucuonto filiosque eos petunt, primum parva corpora duorum puerum capiunt in lacrant necantque devorantque. Tum patrem fortem et filios miseros currentum rapiunt et magni spiris tenent in superant. Ne se al vulneribus defendere nec fugere potest, et ipse utare saucius et aram clamores horrendos ad caelum tolit, edem tempore serpentis fugiunt, pentuntque per fugium in arce Minervae acris. Quod lauquam in equo Minervae hastam ieceret nos putavimus eum ravisse et poenos derese veritatem acerbam nescivimus. Portes patifacimus et admitimus istum ecum in urbum ac puere puleque, o patria o di magni, o Troia eum tangere gaudant, et quoque gaudimus nos misere quibus ille dies fuit ultimus ac quibus numquam eret ullum solacium. So we have a little bit longer passage here. But hopefully your Latin's getting to the point. Remember, ultimately, when you're reading a language, it's not to translate, but to understand. And when we're dealing with literature, one important way to understand is the image. So even looking at this, the important thing is to have an image of what's going on, not to translate. That's just learning. We have to understand the letter before we understand the spirit. But looking at the spirit here, we have this idea of fear and how it's terrifying the minds or souls of someone. And then Laocoon, who is the priest, is sent to the shores. But then there are these two giant serpents who come from the shores and run, and they grab him and other farmers, and they're hissing, and their tongues are coming out. Everybody's fleeing, and Laocoon is seeking for his sons, who seemingly are ensconced in this terror of these snakes. And the first boy of the boys is taken into its mouth and lacerated and devoured. And then the father, runs to his, literally his miserable sons, his sons in pain, and he takes the two. Again, we have this image here. What's going on here? Trying to save his sons' lives, and of course, he's not able to, to defend his sons from the death, from the wounds, and you can see the horror and the prayers to the heavens or the gods for help. But of course, we'll see what happens here. But so as you go back here, even if you were just reading here without translating, you should have some sense that of what's going on. And that's really what ultimately you're trying to get to, is to be able to read Latin or German or French or even English and not translate, but to have some image or meaning involved in it. Okay, let's go back a little bit to Latin here. Literally here, another great fear. Oh, miserable story. So, in other words, here's another story filled with fear, or rather, here's another great fear that terrorizes our blind souls. So here is another great fear, oh miserable story, that terrorizes our blind souls. What does that even mean? Well, as it's kind of an ancient idea. It was Horace famously said in one of his letters that caelum non animum mutant qui transmare currunt, that those who cross the sea change the heavens, not their souls. So it's this classical idea that most people are trapped in materialism, trapped in their senses, human beings who are unable to get beyond the blindness of their bodies in order to understand the nature of things as they exist, and how human beings seemingly are fallen into their own temporality. And this leads to all kinds of fears and ignorances that the history of humankind is a record of. Laocoon, um, literally made, or having been made a priest. So this actually is in the present tense. Having been made priest of Neptune by fortune. Maktebat is our verb here. Was sacrificing. So we just have to look up the vocabulary here. Was sacrificing. Well, here we're looking for our direct object, akramtarum, literally a fierce bull, to the altar on the shore. Then, so there he is on the shore making a sacrifice. Two, if you are a Gemini, this means twins. So two powerful twin serpents. So then, literally twin powerful serpents. Then twin powerful serpents pressing. Here's our present participle, or coming, like premeditated. You can see this is where we get the word premeditated. Pressing out from the sea. There's our ablative of separation. Running from the island to the shore, or run from the island to the shore. Now, it was said before, with Virgil in particular, that it's a little bit more complex, but there's always the danger in Virgil. That's why I think the Wheel Ox doesn't do a lot of Virgil in this. There are times when the story is a little bit choppy. It's like we're missing a sentence or two, and that just may be because to put it in Latin would be just too difficult. Virgil is very difficult to read, and this one's not too bad, but generally speaking, Virgil is very, very difficult to read and translate in Latin, just because a lot of times there's a lot of words missing and you have to come up with them, and it's not the ideal text for learning Latin, or author in this case, although kind of one of the gold standards. Yamque, that means and therefore, or and now. Tenebant, so where we get the word tentacles. Literally, they were holding the fields. In other words, they were in control of them, because these giant snakes, and so they were keeping people at a distance is the idea here. So, but keep in mind that the fields and agriculture is an image of life, of fertility, and presumably a place where we get food. So this idea that these snakes or these serpents are in control of a source of life is kind of the image that I think is being induced here. And therefore they were holding the fields, and oculis igne ardentibus, and literally here's our ablative endings, with their eyes blazing, literally in fire, or eyes blazing with fire, literally burning with fire. If you have ardor, or if you are ardent for something, that's a word in English. It's a kind of burning desire. And with their eyes burning with fire, Here's our verb, lamebant. If something is lambasted, they were licking their mouths with hissing tongues, with their sibyllitic tongues. So a lot of ablative here. So they were licking their mouths with their hissing tongues. Your linguistics, lingua in Latin, as you know, means tongue. Nos omnes fugimus. So literally, we all flee. And we can just keep that. So we all flee, or all of us flee. Ille via certe lauquon filios que eos petunt. We all flee. Now here, since it's in the plural, it must be the serpents, because we don't have any other antecedent in the plural. So they, so ille they look for Laocoon's sons, literally on the way, or they seek a way to find Laocoon's sons. Again, you can read about the context for this on the next page. But the snakes are looking for the sons. First, they seize, or they take. First, they seize literally the small bodies of the two boys. So corpora is a neuter noun of the second declension. So this is second declension neuter plural. That's our direct object. And then this one is second declension as well, but in the genitive plural, e orum is os is. So first, they seize, or they take the small bodies of the two boys. And don't forget to use the conjunctions to kind of separate it. In class, I would always put, using the overhead projector, kind of backslash here, just to kind of, let's get this first, and then that breaks the sentence into a little bit more manageable length. And then we have three verbs here. So we have very imagistic idea here. And they lacerate, kill, and devour them. Wow. So they lacerate, kill, and devour. Then, okay, so there goes the sons. Then, let's see, our verb here is right here. So then they take by force. Then they take the brave father, and they get him, go after him next. Who is running to literally his miserable sons. So then they take the brave father, literally to the sons, miserable running. And so the context is, we have to know that it's this father who is doing this. And so we probably have to put that relative pronoun in our translation. So then they take the brave father who is running towards his suffering sons, writhing in pain, and they hold him. So literally, because there's no him in here, but that's the sense of, then they hold. So magni spiris, literally in their great coils, I guess. They're kind of wrapping themselves around. So notice the irony here is they're suffocating him, taking the spiritus or spirit out of him in their act of coiling. And conquer him, literally conquer him or overpower him or kill him, but literally overcome him. Nexe al vonibus defendere nec fugere potest. So we got to be able to recognize here the verb is in the third person, so it's shifting back to Laocoon, the priest here. So he is neither able to flee nor defend himself from the wounds. And again, you could, so literally, neither himself from wounds defend nor flee, he is able. So you can, as often in Latin, you can change the word order, but the important thing is to get the words in the correct tense and the meaning. So he's not able to flee nor defend himself from the wounds. And he himself, I guess, as a wounded bull, at the altar, so he's being sacrificed by the gods here, so to speak, is the sense of it. And as a wounded bull at the altar, he raises his literally his horrendous cries to the heavens. So he's pleading for the gods to save him and his sons. He's pleading. He raises his horrendous cries to the heavens, literally to the heaven, because it is in the singular, but he's certainly beseeching in some upward direction to be saved from this horror. At the same time, so eo datum tempore just probably needs to be memorized. At the same time, the serpents hurry away. In other words, during this beseeching of the gods, and they seek refuge in the shrine of, I guess, Minerva, or in Keen, or let's see, Akris. Do they give us how to translate that? So you can, so I didn't do this because, but I encourage you, the coils would be, so they give us a lot of vocab here. Akris, no, they don't have that here. So I'm trying to think of the, lost our text here. So I guess shrewd Minerva or keen Minerva. Still not, I might want to use a dictionary. Let me see, just use Whitaker's words here. Let's see, Whitaker's words. So sharp Minerva, bitter, piercing, shrill, sagacious, keen, or severe. So the idea, of course, is the gods are more powerful than Laocoon, and hence human religions, because he's a priest, and so you can kind of decide which translation is going to work for you on that. So he raises his, and they seek refuge in the citadel of keen, or of shrewd, or of cruel Minerva. Quad Laocoon and Econ Minerva hastam yekrat. Because Laocoon had, so Yakio, Yakare, Yakiaktum, this is where we get the word javelin, had thrown a spear. Remember the earlier one about the Trojan horse? So maybe this is the context of this. Because Laocoon had thrown a spear into the horse of Minerva. Remember, the Greeks made their Trojan horse by the art of Minerva in the previous reading. We think, or we thought, so nos putavius, so we get the word putative, which has some idea of thinking. We thought that he, so here's our infinitive finally, indirect speech. We thought that he had erred and had been punished. Literally had been given penalties, but had been punished. Nescivimus, remember nescio means to not know. So we didn't know the literally acerbic truth. Acerbic is like sour, but we didn't know the real truth, or the bitter truth, or acerbic truth. We just saw a moment ago how to translate this. We didn't know the bitter truth, the shrill truth. You can decide which one. In Virgil's case, oftentimes it means many of these things at the same time. So we didn't know the shrill truth or the bitter truth. Portes patefacimus. So a patio. I grew up in Arizona. Patios in like an open outdoor seating area. So we opened up the gates and literally admitted or let in that horse into the city. And the boys and the girls, O fatherland, O great gods, O Troys, praised, or rather rejoiced, in, let's see how, rejoice to touch it. So we're talking about the Trojan horse. And let's see, also, we praised, I guess, and also we miserable ones were praising or giving praise. Let's see, this is a little bit tricky here. Quibus ille dies fuit. And we miserable ones gave praise to him, ille quibus, that day. Let's see here. The ending part doesn't. That's what I mean about translating Virgil. When they use Virgil in this textbook, it's kind of choppy, trying to get a sense of the narrative here. Let's go back a little bit here. So, and also boys and girls rejoiced to touch it, saying, what were they saying? O fatherland, O great gods, O Troy. In other words, they were relieved to seemingly be safe. And we who are wretched also rejoice. Also were rejoicing on that day. And not really sure how to translate this last part here. So, and also we were rejoicing, also we miserable ones were rejoicing on that day. And even though there will never be any comfort. This last paragraph would not be on the test, but it's kind of choppy. So the idea is that on the one hand, it seemed like they had won a victory over the Greeks, but of course, as you can see in this story, that there was revenge against the Troys for their insult of Minerva, and the snakes are taking revenge as a kind of warning against Laocoon for challenging the art of Minerva. Okay, let me give it one more chance here to see if I get a better flow on this one. So we opened the gates and let in that horse into the city, and the boys and the girls were rejoicing in touching it, touching the horse, it is, O fatherland, O great gods. And we miserable ones were also rejoicing. I guess the idea there, since they were involved in a long war, that they were tired, wretched, miserable. They're very glad that the war is finally over, that the Greeks seemingly had gone and left behind this Trojan horse. And we miserable ones were also rejoicing. To him who on that day helped us receive this ultimate victory. And then here's where it gets a little bit unclear. And even though there will never be any solace. So, all right. Well, that's a lot of Latin for this week. Again, take a look at the first 11, and then in particular the first 2 paragraphs in this reading. So for Wednesday, we'll have our discussion. Next week will be a review week. And then for the test, it won't be chapter 26. So it's going to be 25, 24, 23. So 23, 24, 25 will be the basis of the next test. And so you'll have an opportunity to ask any questions for review. And please let me know if you have any other questions. Thank you.